Hello Internet, today we're exploring a GPU that's actually cheaper than the game Arc Raiders itself. The game costs just £30 on Steam. That sets our budget today, meaning we need a card that comes in under that price. And thus enter the EVGA GTX 780. Yes, this little gem made its debut back in 2013. And I got this one for well under the budget, coming in at £23.38. With shipping included from eBay Marketplace. And honestly, this card is quite the legend in its own right. So we're in for an interesting video. Today we're running this test on an i9-13900K, paired with a Z790 motherboard and 64GB of DDR5 RAM, making sure that the GPU is the only thing holding performance back. But the real question is, can the GTX 780 actually run Arc Raiders at all? Let's find out. First, we're playing at native 1080p resolution with low settings. Motion blur is disabled and with no anti-aliasing at all, just to establish a baseline without any upscaling involved. When I first launched this game, I received a driver warning, indicating that performance might be impacted. Well, no Sherlock. Considering that the drivers have been outdated for a long time, the card no longer receives new performance optimizations, bug fixes, or support for newer games, meaning that the performance you see here is essentially the best this GPU can deliver. But overall, it doesn't look too bad at all. The trees are somewhat rough around the edges, and there's some popping as things load. It's actually quite playable, and that's what truly matters. But I wouldn't recommend sticking with these settings for long term. Yes, we're averaging around 50 FPS here and pulling about 190 watts, which is fairly reasonable considering it's rocking just 3GB of VRAM and it's like 13 years old. Now let's give the same settings a go, but this time with temporal super resolution set to 100% resolution scale, meaning we're still working with the same native resolution and avoiding any upscaling for now. However, we'll be using TSR for anti-aliasing this time around, so in the next part I think we should actually implement a little bit of upscaling. Running Arc Raiders on a GTX 780 is actually quite impressive. It still performs surprisingly well, but it can't match modern GPUs in efficiency or support for newer features. It shows how well built the card was and how optimized this game really is. Actually being able to run a modern title at all on hardware this old is a testament to how the GTX 780's legendary status is still alive today. Now, going back to using TSR for anti-aliasing, I wouldn't recommend it on lower end cards like this one. As you can see, we dropped down to 35 FPS, so simply turning on this feature has a very noticeable negative impact on performance, which is what, about a 40% increase on this one? Anyway, moving on. For this next part, TSR is set to 67% resolution scale. To be exact, that's 1288 by 724. So basically we're looking at 720p upscaled. It's definitely a touch softer, but the trade-off is huge because we're seeing a massive 50% jump in performance by doing so. This is actually the same logic behind features like DLSS. Think back to when Nvidia first dropped the RTX 20 series. DLSS 1.0 was a total game changer. Yes, it was a bit rough around the edges, but that AI upscaling could actually pull off the magic in a sense. Unfortunately, the GTX 780 doesn't have that luxury. So, to get the job done today, we're leaning on Unreal Engine 5's built-in upscaler instead. Now let's try Intel XeSS upscaling and set it to the quality preset. So right now it's basically not doing any upscaling yet. And Intel, surprise surprise, was honestly the biggest letdown today. Instead of giving us the usual performance boost you'd expect from AI upscaling, it actually made things worse. The frame rate dropped hard into the 20 FPS range. And that just adds to the concerns that people already have about Intel software. And in a fast-paced game like this, 20 FPS just doesn't cut it. Now, looking at the minimum system requirements for ARC Raiders, if you want to run the game at 1080p 60fps on low settings, you'll need at least an Intel Core i5-6600K or an AMD Ryzen 5 1600, 12GB of RAM and a GPU like the GTX 1050 Ti, RX 580 or Intel Arc A380. I'll have to try it on my Intel Arc A380 actually, that would be quite interesting. It should run it, but we'll see. You'll also need at least a 4GB of VRAM and support DirectX 12, so the Intel Arc A380 would be a good choice because it's got 6GB of VRAM. Right, moving on. Alrighty then, let's see if Intel Xess makes things better on the ultra performance setting. Unfortunately, we're still seeing no more than 20 FPS, so using different presets doesn't magically fix things. The frame rate barely budges, and the experience remains choppy and inconsistent. Back in 2013, this card was an absolute beast, but gaming has evolved, and so have the system requirements. Right, so now we're using TAUU with a 67% resolution scale. That means the game is basically rendering at 720p, and then upscaled to 1080p. And honestly, I think we found the sweet spot for older graphics cards. TAUU is kind of like TSR's little brother. It works in a very similar way, but it's a lot lighter on your GPU. That means you get better performance and more FPS, but it will come at a sacrifice to visual fidelity. Now, back when the GTX 780 launched in 2013, the GPU market was a bit of a battleground, dominated by two very different contenders. AMD's HD 7970 and the Nvidia GTX 780. The 780 was Nvidia's real powerhouse, built specifically to go toe-to-toe with the HD 7970. It certainly wasn't for the faint of heart. But then, just to keep things interesting, AMD decided to up their game with the Radeon R9 290X, undercutting Nvidia's top-tier cards by a mile. Those reference blowers could run really hot, hitting 95 degrees at times. And when the fans really kicked in, the thing sounded like a World War II bomber taking off from Heathrow Airport. I can't wrap my head around the fact that this is an Unreal Engine 5 game, and it's running on a 3GB GPU. So, after finding the sweet spot with these settings, and with motion blur turned off, I wanted to see if we could still hit 60 FPS and still make things look a little bit better. So, this time around I've set the game to medium settings, and with TAUU running at 67% resolution scale. Interestingly, after really putting the EVGA GTX 780 through its paces, the answer to the original question is yes. It actually can run ARC Raiders, and honestly it's kind of wild. We're talking about a graphics card that launched all the way back in 2013, with just 3GB of VRAM, outdated drivers and zero support for modern features. The fact that it can even boot up Unreal Engine 5 games, let alone deliver something that's actually playable, is seriously impressive. ARC Raiders officially asks for a GTX 1050 Ti or better, and yet here we are, running it on a 13-year-old 3GB card that costs less than the game itself. That alone says a lot about both how well this game is optimised and just how well overbuilt the GTX 780 was back in the day. And with that said, I think it's safe to say the GTX 780 isn't dead, at least not today. If you want a deeper dive, I actually have a more in-depth video on the GTX 780, and I'll throw it up on screen right about now. If you enjoyed this look at the GTX 780, give it a like, subscribe for more retro PC experiments, and drop a comment below to let me know what old hardware we should test next. Thanks for watching, I'm David James, and I'll catch you in the next one.